Chapter 17. Jason was frustrated. He'd been staring at the orb for 30 minutes while his minions were off doing what he'd assigned them. They would be back soon. He was confident they would succeed in bringing back the two giants. They were strong, and they were many. But they were too strong, too many. Stronger than him, anyway. Jason knew he could control them now that the orb had been refilled with the venom of the leech, but that didn't make him feel any more comfortable. He had to find a way to either reduce his slave's strength or eliminate it entirely, and there was no way he would be able to do that without the other half of the supplement. That's what Jason called it, for that's what it was. He had been so close to getting it from Owen, but that boy was a wily one. Jason's ribs still hurt from where Owen kneed him. With the silver giant outside the youngster's house, Jason hadn't had time to go back and finish what he'd started. So here he sat, clueless as to how to fix his orb. He was in the study of the old couple that owned the house. Jason felt bad for killing them, but he'd needed a place to stay. The Caymans, who'd been nice enough to take Jason and Michael when they first arrived in this world, had been startled when the brothers returned a few days ago. Seeing Michael beaten and unconscious had raised a few questions that Jason didn't want to answer. Earl and Darlene Cayman had been good people, and Jason had vowed to be kind to them once he'd taken control of the world, the same way Michael had to Les Huntington when Les promised to help find Owen in the first place. See? The brothers could be fair. They only resorted to violence if they needed to. But what was the use of taking over the world if your slaves were more powerful than you? Jason shuddered to think of all the things that could go wrong in the future if he didn't fix the problem now. But he couldn't, not with only half of the consciousness that conceived the orb. Arminus had tried coming up with a solution by separating the supplement and studying it. Each half, however, had taken with them different parts of his consciousness. Both contained the strength of the leeches, but one had taken the concept of the orb, and the other took the instructions on how to use it. Jason knew which half Michael had gotten when they had explored Arminus's ship years ago, and how Michael had muttered in his comatose state about the orb of power. Jason had to have it for himself. The power to take over the world was just too great. But he felt incomplete without the other half of the supplement. It didn't make sense to try and fix his minion problem with only half a mind. So he tasked himself with fixing the other problem he had, the Invaders. There wasn't much he could accomplish with them hovering over him the whole time. He knew the Invaders wouldn't leave until they either got the orb or killed everyone so that no one could ever use it. And though he was eliminating one of those choices by having the scepters removed from the ground, Jason knew the Invaders would just plant more. No, these Invaders had to be dealt with now. He got up from the desk, taking the orb with him. He'd never part with it again. He went to the front porch and took a deep breath to clear his head. The sky was clear over the house. The Invaders were elsewhere. Standing on the porch, arms crossed on his forehead, Jason suddenly felt overwhelmed. He was in way over his head, but he couldn't back out now. Just then, he noticed something in the distance. It was half a mile away, and to him it looked like a truck. He stepped off the porch and started walking toward it. He took his time, enjoying the stroll. It relaxed him a bit. If anything, the truck probably belonged to Daniel's twin and his friend. They wouldn't need it anymore, now would they? When Jason reached the truck, he looked in through the driver's side window. He saw a bag on the floor in front of the passenger seat. Trying his luck, he grabbed the door handle. It was unlocked. Taking in the new car's smell, he sat in the driver's seat and grabbed the bag from the floor. It was full of pink and white non-inflated balloons. He looked in the back seat and saw a pump. He looked at the balloons, stretching one of them to read what was stenciled on them. Happy Birthday in white on the pink balloons and in pink on the white ones. Setting the bag in the passenger seat, he gripped the steering wheel and pretended he was driving it. The truck was very nice and very clean. He wanted it for himself, and wouldn't you know it, the keys were still in the ignition. He started the truck, admiring the soft purr of the engine. He drove it back to the house and parked it next to the Cayman's old beat-up red truck. He still felt frustrated about the orb when he went inside the house, but not as much as earlier now that he had a shiny new truck. As soon as he stepped into the foyer, he noticed the robot in the living room on the right. He'd completely forgotten about it, with its brown trench coat and fedora. And its backpack. Jason walked over to it and took the pack off the robot. He sat down in a nearby chair and looked inside. What he saw made him grin ear to ear. Doug opened his eyes, and the moment he did, he regretted it. First, he noticed the pain in his head, which caused him to vomit right there and then. Next, he felt the pain in his left shoulder, and he threw up again. Once he was done, he took in his surroundings. He was in a dark, cold room. There was a little light coming from a massive hole in the wall next to a closed door. He could see a kitchen through the hole. Suddenly, he remembered where he was and why he was in so much pain. He was in the old folks' garage. The basketball Jason had beaten him with had felt like a cannonball. Doug should have been dead after the hit to the head, and for a moment he had a feeling that he had been, but now he was alive, and in horrible pain. He tried to stand, but couldn't at first. He succeeded on his second try, but as soon as he took a step, his foot came into contact with something. Doug almost yelled out in surprise. He knew instantly that it was a body. He stood in silence for a whole minute, his heart beating in his ears. Finally, he knelt down and touched the body. Then he dragged it to where the light was plentiful and saw that it was Curtis. And he was alive. He slapped Curtis's face to wake him up. Curtis groaned, then opened his eyes and looked at Doug. "Why are you hitting me?" Curtis asked groggily. "Because you were unconscious, stupid." Curtis looked around and said, "Where are we?" "We're in a garage," Doug said. "How did you get in here?" "I don't know," Curtis said uneasily. "I saw Jason take you into the house, so I doubled back. When I finally reached you guys, I saw you on the floor." Curtis looked Doug in the eyes. "I thought you were dead." "I should be," Doug said. "I think I was. I remember a dream I had where I was in some bright room, and then my brother came to me and told me it wasn't my time." Curtis started at that. "Me too, except it was a girl. Jason punched me in the chest. I think it killed me. That's where that came from." He gestured toward the hole in the wall. "The girl said the same thing to me. Next thing I remember is waking up just now. Jason must have thought I was dead and dumped me in here with you." They both laughed, and then cringed at their respective wounds. Doug helped Curtis to his feet. "I know this is going to sound crazy," Doug said uneasily, "but I think the girl you saw was Alyssa." "Owen's friend?" Doug nodded. "Not so crazy," Curtis said reassuringly. "If you saw your brother." "Really?" Doug asked, his face lighting up. "Yes, I guess they're watching over us." They stood in silence for a while. Then Doug said, "I saw Dee in the living room." "Me too, but I don't think Owen's here. Jason asked me where he was." "Where do you think he is?" "I have no idea." They stared at each other for a moment. Then Curtis walked over to the hole and looked through. "Coast is clear," he said over his shoulder. He went to grab the doorknob when Doug stopped him. "We should get some weapons," he said as he turned to the tool rack on the other side of the garage. Curtis followed him, making sure not to block the light. Doug grabbed a screwdriver as Curtis grabbed a hammer. They compared weapons. "A screwdriver?" Curtis scoffed. "Seriously? It's good for stabbing." Doug demonstrated by stabbing the air. Curtis shook his head and went back to the door. Doug followed. Curtis heard a noise, but had no idea what was making it. To him, it sounded like someone hammering something. Whatever the noise was, it was coming from a room up ahead on the right. Doug and Curtis stood in front of a dark room, and though Curtis had ignored it the first time he passed it, he couldn't help looking into it now. He couldn't see anything in the room, but he could feel someone, something, watching him. He shivered and moved away from the room, eager to be out of sight of whatever was in there. They came up on the noisy room. It was brightly lit. Curtis leaned up against the wall and peeked in. He saw Jason sitting on the floor in front of a desk with his back to the door. He was hunched over, tinkering with something. Curtis studied the contents near Jason. He saw Owen's backpack to the left of the blonde, with dozens of those little red bombs spilling out. Some of them had their casings removed, though. To the right of Jason was the bag of pink and white balloons Curtis had seen in Cullen's truck. On the floor in front of the desk was the pump. "What is Jason doing?" Curtis wondered. Doug patted him lightly on the back and asked what was going on. Curtis shrugged. Whatever Jason was doing, he wasn't going to get a chance to finish because Curtis was going to bash his brains in. He stepped quietly into the study, holding his breath as he did so. He feared his racing heart would give him away, but so far, Jason remained ignorant to his presence. Jason was way too strong to take on face to face. Curtis needed to surprise him. As he drew closer, he noticed that some of the bombs had been placed inside the balloons and piled up next to the pump, waiting to be inflated. He stepped closer so that now he was only a few feet from Jason. Curtis raised the hammer, preparing to strike, when a hand reached from behind him and covered his mouth. He was about to yell, but then he saw that it was only Doug. He slowly pulled Curtis back out to the hall. Now they were standing in front of the screen door, feeling the breeze from outside. Doug released him. "What are you doing?" Curtis asked quietly but furiously. Doug pointed out the screen door. Curtis saw immediately what Doug had noticed. Silver was coming. The two boys crept out the door quietly and ran around to the side of the house. They weren't too surprised to see Cullen's truck parked there. They hid on the side of the truck. The doors were locked. As the giant approached the house, nearly 20 zombies followed in its wake. "I guess they succeeded," Doug whispered. Curtis nodded, never taking his eyes off the scene. The tremors Silver produced had alerted Jason to its arrival. He came out of the house and stood in front of the giant. "Well done," Jason said to Silver. "Bow to me." On command, the giant knelt down on one knee and dipped its head close to the ground. "Open up," Jason said. The seam that ran along Silver's head split apart with a loud bang. The skull opened to reveal a cockpit similar to that of an airplane. 3 of Jason's minions were at the helm. There were 3 chairs, one next to each ear, and one in the front between the eyes. Doug and Curtis stared with their jaws dropped. "Very good," Jason said. "I'm almost ready. When I'm done, you are to take this giant into the middle of that field." He pointed to a big open patch of land far away. and signal the mothership. Tell them you have the orb. Then they will retrieve you." Doug and Curtis exchanged nervous glances. "What is he planning?" Doug asked. Curtis thought for a second, then his face changed as realization dawned on him. "You know that cop friend of yours? The one we saw on the news? Call him and tell him to stop those zombies from taking control of Blue." Patrick felt his phone vibrate. "Hello? Officer Fisher, it's Doug Hudson. Where the hell have you been? I've been trying to reach you for hours. I don't have time to explain. I need you to believe me when I tell you this. There are some people on their way downtown right now to take control of the Blue Giant. You have to stop them." "People? What people?" Patrick looked around nervously. He was standing behind the barricades a few yards away from the giant. Lindsay stood next to him, her face wary. "Some really bad people," Doug said. "They're really strong and very dangerous. They might already be there. You have to stop them by any means necessary. They already got the silver one." "The silver one? How do you know that?" "Because we saw it happen. Trust me when I tell you that you can't let these people get that giant." Patrick looked to the end of the street. The sky was clear, but the sun was setting and everything was dark blue. If there were people coming for the giant, Patrick would have a hard time seeing them. "Where are you, Mr. Hudson?" "I'm in Birch." "What are you doing there?" "It's a long story and I'll explain later. Like I said, though, keep those people away from the giant." Patrick, who had his back to the Blue Giant, said, "Look, Mr. Hudson, I don't get what's going on here, but—" There was a loud groan behind him. He spun around and saw the giant stumbling around, swatting at its legs. It fell backward onto the building behind it, shattering even more glass than it did earlier. Pieces of the building rained down to the street. "What the hell is going on?" Lindsay asked. Patrick shook his head and stared at the giant's legs to see what it was swatting at. He gasped when he saw that it was people, crawling up the giant's body like bugs. Silver's head snapped shut as the giant stood up to its full height. "Now go," Jason ordered it. Silver turned and made its way to the field designated earlier. Then Jason said to his minions standing around in the yard, "Go, as fast as you can, to downtown San Sebastian. Help the others retrieve the Blue Giant." The zombies darted down the country road in the same direction as Silver. Doug and Curtis watched as Chris went with them. "What now?" Doug asked quietly as Jason went back into the house. "We have to stop that giant before it reaches that field and gets picked up by the mothership." Wow, that's a sentence I never thought I'd say. "How are we going to do that?" Doug asked hopelessly. "We'll trip 'em. We don't have the keys, and I'm not going back in that house." Doug hugged himself and shivered, and Curtis knew it had nothing to do with the cold air. "You should have let me brain Jason when I had the chance. Then I could have gotten the keys from him." Doug shrugged. "I know. I panicked when I saw Silver coming. Sorry." Curtis stared at the truck for a second, then down at the hammer in his hand. He didn't want to go back in the house either, and he now felt doubtful that the hammer would make much of a difference to Jason, considering Curtis had put all he could behind his punches earlier, and they had done nothing to the blonde. "Forgive me, Colin," Curtis said a second before smashing in the driver's side window. "What are you doing?" Doug asked. "Hot wiring it." Patrick continued to watch the strangers climb the Blue Giant. They climbed with a grace that normal people couldn't possibly possess. "Those have to be the ones Doug warned me about," Patrick told himself. "Freeze!" he shouted to the strangers, knowing it would do no good. He drew his firearm and aimed it at the frantic giant as it continued to destroy buildings around it in its effort to get the bug people off of its body. Glass spilled down to the streets. Patrick, Lindsay, and the other officers shielded themselves as best they could. When the glass shower was over, Patrick looked up to see the strangers prying open the giant's head at the seam. The head opened with the sound of grinding gears. The left side stood open at an awkward angle as the strangers piled into the giant's cranium. The blue creature staggered for a few seconds, then stood absolutely still. The officers watched from the street, weapons drawn. Suddenly, the giant was on the move again, no longer staggering, but walking with its usual motion. Patrick saw something fall from the still open head. It looked like a body. Perhaps one of the insect people had fallen out. Then 2 more bodies fell to the street. Patrick ran over to them and was stunned by what he saw when he got there. All 3 bodies were dressed in silver-blue jumpsuits and helmets with copper-colored visors, which were cracked a little. They looked like astronauts, almost. Aliens. Patrick couldn't see into the helmets and very much wanted to take them off to get a better look at these mysterious bodies. Just then, he remembered the hijacked giant. He looked up and saw it messing with one of the 4 scepters it had planted earlier. A few of the strange hijackers were standing on the giant's shoulders.